The smell of coffee I never finished is still sitting on the counter. Third morning in a row I've made it and let it go cold. I keep thinking about the drive home. 41 miles from the venue to my house, and I counted every one of them in the dark. No radio, no crying, which surprised me. Just the sound of the highway and my hands on the wheel and this strange, quiet feeling, like when you drop something valuable and you're still in the half second before it hits the ground. My daughter got married on a Saturday in October. I left before the cake was cut. Let me go back some, not far, just enough for this to make sense. I raised my daughter alone from the time she was 9 years old. Her father wasn't a bad man, he just wasn't a present one, and eventually those two things start to look the same. I worked as a bookkeeper for a small manufacturing company outside of Dayton, Ohio for over 30 years, not glamorous work. But it was steady, and it was honest, and it let me keep the lights on and her in good shoes, and later out of debt when she finished college. The house I live in, the one my mother left me when she passed in 2009, sits on just over 4 acres in a township outside the city. It's not grand. The porch sags on the left side, and the kitchen needs new flooring, and there's a window in the back bedroom that lets in cold air every January no matter how many times I've had it resealed. But it's mine. My mother paid it off herself, dollar by dollar, working at a dry cleaner for decades. And she signed it over to me 2 months before she died, and I have never once taken that lightly. My daughter grew up in that house, learned to ride a bike in the driveway, had her prom photos taken on the front steps, cried on my shoulder in the living room when her first serious boyfriend broke her heart junior year of college. That house held all of it. When she called me in February to tell me she was engaged, I cried, happy cries, the kind that catch you off guard. I liked the man she'd chosen, or I thought I did. He was polished, well-spoken, worked in real estate development, the kind of man who always seems to know what things are worth. I should have paid more attention to that last part. The planning started almost immediately. My daughter is organized, always has been, and she threw herself into the wedding with the same focus she brings to everything. I was included at first. We toured venues together. I sat beside her at tastings. She sent me color swatches and asked my opinion on centerpieces and called me on Sunday evenings to talk through the guest list. Then, somewhere around May, things shifted. It was gradual. The Sunday calls got shorter, then less frequent. When I'd ask about a detail, she'd say her fiancé had handled it, or that the planner had made the decision already. Once I mentioned that a cousin on my side hadn't received her invitation yet, and my daughter said, a little too quickly, that they were finalizing the list and some people might not make the final cut. That cousin had known my daughter her whole life. She'd driven her to the ER when my daughter had appendicitis in 2017. She was not the kind of person who ends up on a cut list. I didn't push. I told myself every bride gets overwhelmed. I told myself I was being sensitive. In July, my daughter's fiancé came by the house alone. I made sweet tea and we sat at the kitchen table. He was charming the way he always was, asked about my garden, asked about my health. And then, after a few minutes of that, he set his glass down and looked at me in a way that was too steady, too prepared. And he said he wanted to talk to me about something. He said the property I owned was in a location that was being looked at by developers, that a company he worked with had been acquiring land in that corridor for a mixed-use project, that he thought, given how close we'd all be as family, it might make sense to think about what I'd like to do with the house and the acreage long term. He said the word legacy twice. He said he only wanted to make sure I was protected. I listened to all of it. Then I thanked him for the sweet tea compliment and said I'd think about it. After he left, I stood in the kitchen for a long time. I didn't say anything to my daughter. I wanted to see what came next. What came next was August. My daughter called on a Tuesday, a real call, longer than the ones we'd been having, and in the middle of talking about the ceremony she mentioned, almost sideways, that it might be nice to have the house and property legally sorted before the wedding. For clarity, she said, for peace of mind. She said her fiancé knew an attorney who specialized in estate planning and that the consultation would be free, and there was no pressure. She just thought it was something I should consider. I said I had my own attorney. She said I knew, of course, but this person had more experience with property transfers specifically. Property transfers. I noted that phrase. I said I'd keep it in mind. After we hung up, I sat in my mother's old chair, the wingback one in the corner of the living room that I've reupholstered twice but cannot bring myself to replace. And I thought about the way she'd said sorted and transfers and peace of mind. And I thought about how my mother worked for 31 years pressing and steaming other people's clothes so that one day her daughter would have 4 acres and a porch and a place to belong. I didn't sleep well that night. The wedding was at a vineyard about 40 minutes south of the city. October, like I said. The kind of day that looks like a painting, gold light, leaves turning, air that smells faintly of wood smoke. I wore my navy dress, the one I'd bought specifically for the occasion, and I had my hair done the morning before at a salon in Kettering, where I've been going for 11 years. I arrived early because I am always early. That's just who I am. A coordinator I hadn't met before greeted me at the entrance and checked my name against a list. There was a pause when she found it, brief, the kind you might not notice if you weren't already paying attention. She smiled and directed me to a seat in the third row off to the side. Not a seat of honor, not the seat that had been shown to me in the venue photos my daughter had texted back in the spring when I was still part of the plans. I sat down, I smoothed my dress. I watched people I mostly didn't know take their seats around me. The ceremony was beautiful. I will say that clearly, because it was. My daughter was radiant. Whatever had changed between us, whatever had been building, it wasn't in her face when she walked down that aisle. She looked like herself, like the girl I'd raised, and I felt the particular ache of that, of loving someone completely and feeling something between you that you can't name yet. During the reception, I found a seat at a table near the window. A few relatives came to say hello. My cousin, the one whose invitation had apparently made the cut after all, squeezed my hand and didn't say much, which meant she'd noticed things too. My daughter moved through the room in that way that brides do, table to table, never stopping long, anywhere. She came to me eventually, hugged me, said I looked beautiful, and then was pulled away before we could exchange more than a minute's worth of words. And I watched her go and thought, this is fine. There will be time later. There wasn't time later. Around 8 o'clock, my daughter's new mother-in-law approached me. She was pleasant enough, a woman in a cream blazer who smelled of expensive perfume. She made small talk for a few minutes, and then she mentioned something about the property. She'd heard it was a lovely piece of land. She said it in the way people say things when they've been told to say them. Rehearsed, careful, angled. I said yes, it had been in my family a long time. She said that was so meaningful, and that, of course, family should look out for family. I smiled and excused myself to get water. 20 minutes later, my daughter found me near the bar. Her husband was at her side. And she said, quietly, not unkindly, but in a voice that had clearly practiced itself, that they needed me to give them some space for the rest of the evening, that some of the guests were important to her husband's work, and she wanted the night to go smoothly, that she hoped I understood. I looked at her for a moment, at her husband's face just behind her shoulder, watchful and still. I said I understood perfectly. I picked up my clutch. I said goodbye to my cousin. I walked out of the vineyard past the string lights and the flower arrangements and the waitstaff with their trays of champagne, and I got into my car and I drove 41 miles home. I slept, which also surprised me. I think sometimes the body just decides to protect you. At 9:14 the next morning, my phone rang. It was my daughter. I let it ring twice before I answered. Not to be dramatic, just because I needed those 2 seconds. She said good morning. She said she hoped I'd slept well. She said the night had been wonderful and she was so happy I could be there. I waited. Then she said she'd been thinking, and she felt like now might be a good time to move forward with the property paperwork. Her husband knew a notary who could come to the house this week if that worked for me. They could get it drafted quickly and then everyone would have clarity going forward. I said, not yet. She said she didn't understand. I said I needed to make some calls first. She said it was really a simple process and she didn't want it to become a whole thing. I said I'd be in touch and I ended the call. I have an attorney. I've had the same attorney for 16 years, a woman named Patricia who handled my mother's estate and has since reviewed every significant document I've signed. I called her that Monday morning after I'd made a fresh pot of coffee that I actually drank this time. I told her everything. The July conversation with my son-in-law. The August call about the estate attorney he'd recommended. The request the morning after the wedding. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, don't sign anything. Don't speak to anyone they've recommended. Come in Thursday. I went in Thursday. What she explained to me was not complicated, but it was clarifying. The corridor my property sits in had been the subject of acquisition activity for about 2 years. Several parcels nearby had already changed hands. The way she laid it out, carefully, without dramatics, was that my 4 acres were worth considerably more than I'd understood. Not to me. Not in terms of what they meant to my family or what my mother had sacrificed to hold on to them. But on paper, to a developer, to someone who could rezone and build and sell. She asked if I wanted to protect the property. I said yes. We spent 2 hours that afternoon going over my options. I asked questions I hadn't thought to ask before. I learned things I should have already known. Patricia walked me through each document patiently and without making me feel foolish for not having understood sooner. What I decided, and I decided it alone, sitting in that office with the afternoon light coming through the blinds, was to place the property in a trust. Not in my daughter's name. Not in any arrangement that could be transferred or leveraged without my explicit direction while I'm living. The trust named my mother's church as a secondary beneficiary, a congregation on the east side of Dayton that had meant something to her and still meant something to me. If something happened to me before I changed my mind, the land would go somewhere that had nothing to do with development. Patricia filed the paperwork within the week. My daughter called several more times over the following days. I answered when I felt steady enough to do so. The conversations were difficult. She said she didn't understand why I was making this complicated. She said she and her husband had only been trying to help. She said the attorney they'd recommended was highly regarded and that I was being paranoid and that she was hurt I didn't trust her. I listened to all of it. Then I said, I love you. I have loved you since before you could hold your own head up. I would do almost anything for you. But this house belonged to your grandmother, and before I hand it to anyone, including you, I need to understand what I'm doing and why, and I needed to do that on my own terms with someone who answers to me. She said she'd never asked me to hand it to anyone. I said I knew. I said I hoped that was true. There was a silence that stretched longer than I expected. Then she said she had to go. She didn't call for several weeks after that. Neither did I. I'm not going to tell you that was easy. I want to be honest about that. I walked around the house in the evenings and looked at her school pictures on the wall. The gap-toothed one from second grade, the serious one from her senior year, and I felt the particular grief of loving someone who has, for whatever reason, chosen someone else's agenda over the relationship you thought you'd built together. I cleaned out the back bedroom, fixed the window myself with a better seal, and some weather stripping I got at the hardware store, repotted my begonias for the winter. My cousin came by one Sunday and we sat on the porch and I told her most of it. She said she'd noticed things at the wedding. She said she'd been worried. She held my hand and we watched the light change over the yard and she said, "You did the right thing." I didn't say anything. I just watched the light. My daughter called again in early December. This time her voice was different. Some of the performance had gone out of it. She sounded tired. She said she wanted to talk. Not about the property, just to talk. I said okay. She came over on a Saturday. I made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where her fiancé had sat months earlier with his carefully prepared words, and she looked older than she had at the wedding, and I thought, so do I, probably. She said Ava's husband had told her what he was hoping to accomplish with the property. Not everything, and maybe not the truth, but enough that something in her had started to understand. She said she'd asked him directly and hadn't loved the answer. She said she didn't know what any of it meant for them yet, but she'd needed to come and see me. I didn't say I told you so. I want to be clear about that. It wasn't what she needed, and it wasn't what I felt. What I felt was tired and sad and relieved all at the same time. The way you feel after a long storm finally passes and you go outside to check the damage and find that the things you'd tried to protect are still standing. I said, I'm glad you came. She said, I'm sorry, Mum. I reached across the table and I held her hand. I didn't tell her what I'd done with the property. That conversation can come later, when we've had more time to rebuild what got damaged. What I know is that the paperwork is filed, the trust is in place, and the 4 acres that my mother pressed strangers' shirts to hold on to are not going anywhere. People used to ask me, when my daughter was small and I was raising her on a bookkeeper's salary and sheer stubbornness, how I managed. I never had a good answer. You just do, I'd say. You just keep going. I think what I've learned at 63 years old is that protecting something isn't always a dramatic act. Sometimes it's just sitting in an attorney's office on a Thursday afternoon and asking the right questions. Sometimes it's not signing a document you don't understand. Sometimes it's driving 41 miles home in the dark without crying and making coffee you actually drink in the morning and deciding that what your mother built deserves someone who will fight for it quietly and completely. My mother never told me the land was mine to keep forever. She told me it was mine to steward. I think I finally understand what she meant.